The Sinaticast is a politically neutral, free speech platform. As such, language, themes, and topics can and will be discussed that might offend some viewers of certain political, religious, or ideological leanings. Viewer discretion is advised. Welcome to episode 1 of the Sinaticast. Today's topic is going to be the collapse of rhetoric. Joining me today are two of my compatriots. The first one on your left on my screen is Gage Boson, independent commentator. And on my right is Blairin, co-owner and head administrator for the RPC Authority, a depoliticized creative writing alternative to the SCP Foundation and free speech advocacy. Blairin, I believe you said you wanted to go first, so you've got the floor. How do you feel in this current day and age? Because it really does seem as though in today's world that there is a sort of insurmountable gulf between people who are on opposite sides of both the political spectrum, I mean, even sort of belief spectrum. It's very rare to see, like, you know, atheists and theists get along. What do you think is at the core of this issue?
Well, I always believe in observing history to observe the modern day. Some people think that's bunk. It can be bunk in some situations, but there's a good amount of time you can observe history to get an accurate representation of the present. And the number one thing in history is that neutral mediators used to be very, very common. But they never had a lot of power. When you think of a neutral mediator, your mind immediately goes to people like Cicero. Someone who it has the respect of both sides, but neither of which would listen to him if they had to.
Just for the viewer, who exactly was Cicero?
Cicero was a politician during the rise of Caesar to dictator, and for a very brief time, emperor. And then, of course, Octavius followed after him. That's not really the point. The point is there was the Pompeians, or there was the Caesarians, the eponymous people being the ones they supported. And both of them hated their guts, and they hated the ideologies that they stood for. Cicero was the only one who could talk to both sides and command the respect of the independent parties. But that was only in times of crisis, like the assassination of Caesar, like the Gallic Wars, like Pompey's rebellion, or Pompey's defense if you're Pompeian. And I think all of us can agree we live in a very, very, very stable time. There are no risks to disagreeing with someone. There are no factors that could come back to bite you in the ass.
Socioeconomic factor.
Purely socioeconomic factors, obviously.
Obviously, Boson is right. There are factors that can come to bite you in the ass, but those things are so far in the distance that most people don't think about them. And even if they do think about them, they say, "Oh no, well, I won't be around anyway." So, and that's the problem. In addition to this sort of how do you say? In addition to this lack of actual crises that would instigate some sort of negotiations, people don't seem to really think about their consequences of their actions.
Could you give an example?
Instead of, for example, in the modern day, of railing for higher taxes on higher income individuals, people just say, "Oh, let's just raise the minimum wage." Distributing more wealth to the largest percentage of the population does nothing when the highest wealth percentage of the population retains all their wealth and still refuses to spend it. That's what taxes are for. Taxes are for directly removing that wealth from their pockets and forcing them to use them.
This is a podcast about tax legislation.
This is a podcast about rhetoric, but rhetoric is politics, and politics is economics.
Well, politics has its route in. See, politics is like where like a lot of topics meet.
I just don't see how your example is related. It's like, well, people don't really negotiate anymore. And then it's like, well, because some people want to do this, and that's dumb.
No, people don't negotiate anymore because people just don't bother to see the outcome of their actions. They don't care. Essentially, they just don't care. There are better ways you can do everything. But that requires effort, and people don't care to put in effort. They don't care. There's no crises, so there's no reason to care. So basically, you have a bunch of interest groups running around who don't represent the people and don't have any real stake in the average American's life, who just they legislate for themselves, and yeah, that's what gets by self-legislation. Like the what was it? Like the sugar tariffs, which is why sugar costs so much.
Well, explain the sugar. Go on.
Is that the fault of there not being a crisis, or is that just the fault of like the system as it exists? I mean, if there were suddenly a crisis, would interest groups no longer be running things? I mean, I doubt.
There's a larger reason why no one cares, and that's decentralization. But I mean, we all know this, and I was hoping someone else would pick up on that later, but I was just going to go down this route. The sugar tariff essentially was... There was a congressman who once gave a speech who said, this group of people wants higher minimum wage, but this group of people dislikes it. So you have two almost equal sides yelling back and forth. Sugar tariffs, this group of people really, really want it, and no one's arguing against it. The congressman passes the law. Your sugar prices randomly go up $1. You don't know why, but the congressman, he probably gets a nice kickback, and those people will support that congressman for the next decade, 2 decades. And it's all because no one cares. No one cares because everyone's arguing about their own policies. They only care about themselves. The greater benefits to society can only occur when there is a time of crisis or people are actively involved in the political system.
So, does that... Well, because I have always been of the opinion that it's a lack of care. So that lack of involvement with the political system, is it not possible that it is a phenomenon where people have convinced themselves that whatever change they attempt to try and actualize will never occur, and therefore there's no point in trying?
That's definitely a factor.
Well, Well,
I want to see what Gauge Casey Boson has to say.
Do you want to give me the floor here?
Mm-hmm.
I think it's a bit of a radical take. I think I have. I think you might be a bit shocked to hear this. I'll be honest. I think the entire concept of there being this great death of rhetoric is kind of just sort of masturbatory and not real. Because the idea of the death of rhetoric implies that there was, at some point in the past, this glorious age where the great marketplace of ideas and people would have a commerce and debate and there would be convincing arguments on both sides. That has never, ever been reality, ever. It's largely a construction of Enlightenment philosophy and only really tried to be implemented in the United States. It's a very America-centric idea. I mean, did the Republicans and the Francoists in Spain have a debate over, whose ideas were better? No, they fought a civil war. Did the National Socialists and the Weimar government have a nice sort of rhetorical back and forth? No, they burnt the Reichstag. And then they took over in a coup.
Actually, I'd say that's rhetoric. I'd say burning down the Reichstag is exactly rhetoric. Because when Caesar overreached, people didn't just sit around and say, oh, well, I guess he's overreaching. They stabbed him to death.
Okay, so then rhetoric isn't dead, because if literally everything is rhetoric, then it can never die. If acts of war count as rhetoric, then there is no death of rhetoric. Well, where has there been a death of rhetoric if we can just define everything as rhetoric?
Well, I mean,
he's having a meme here.
In this, but in our current society, I mean, correct me if you think I'm wrong. It does seem as though there's only one group of people who appear to have the main political stay in all the positions of power.
He's going off script. What the fuck is he saying? Why would you say that?
What group of people like that?
I mean,
what specific group of people are you talking about?
they're predominantly left wing. So.
Oh, okay.
Well, to add on to what I'm saying, like I said, it's a very America-centric perspective, but from an American perspective, there's some legitimacy to that. Because in America, we're sort of living in a post-mass media world, in the sense that mass media was never really a thing for all of human history. And then, for a very brief period in the late 20th century, suddenly, America's society was subjected to all of this mass centralized media through television, through radio, through newspapers, the shit that your parents grew up on, right? This huge, centralized, everybody has the same pool of, cultural, I don't know necessarily cultural, but this pool of, media that everyone is sort of it's like that picture of, Times Square where there's, a episode of Seinfeld on one of the big screens in Times Square. Really, everybody has just stopped looking at the screen. They're all watching the screen, watching Seinfeld. Basically that. And that was really the only period in history where that was possible, made possible due to technology. And now we're sort of exiting that era. We're going back to the status quo, in a sense, because that sort of brief blip of mass media is ending. And with the end of a mass media culture comes the return of, sort of subdivided, sort of stratified society where there are these different niches and they each have their own interests. They will come into conflict. But the problem with that is that this whole Rawlsian fucking enlightenment, yes, the era of rhetoric where we will have debates, and that requires mass media to really operate. Because the only way that you'll have this sort of distinguished both sides are coming in and they'll make a compromise, that's really only possible when everyone is sort of pulling from the same well, so to speak. That's the only situation in which that can be facilitated.
I actually disagree. I think for good rhetoric to happen, you need to be physically there. I think the division of distance and the idea of to each their own, where you don't really have to worry about what's going on the opposite side of the world because you're where you are. That's why I think places like the Roman Forum were so, at least, they got legislation passed quite quickly. The threat of violence is also a very good motivator to pass legislation, which is why I think that is a part of rhetoric.
Well, but there are so many people that sort of just jump on the notion that if you don't agree with me, then by definition you're evil. Like, you know,
True.
that Florida bill that just passed. Unironically, dependent as to what team you're on, blue team, red team. It's either the Don't Say Gay bill or the Anti-Groomer bill. And it doesn't even seem as though those two parties are even talking to each other in regards to what's actually on the legislation.
Well, see, this is what I mean. They're not talking to each other because there's no sort of larger mass like centralized media to control, you know, what information is given to people. They will gather their own information. And when you have the opportunity to gather your own information in your own niche sort of subdivision of society, you will have enough information at your disposal that you really never even have to engage with the other side. And I don't even think that's a bad thing necessarily, but it just means that, you know, like, you can say that they're not talking to each other, but, like, what would the end goal of them talking to each other really be? What is the compromise of something like that, you know?
There is a compromise, but they wouldn't like it.
The idea.
Go ahead.
The whole idea of, like, well, these two sides just need to talk it out implies that there's, like, a middle position that they can both reach, that they'll both be happy with. But in most cases, I think in almost all of human history, that's not really the case.
The Gacy.
Well, I mean, Greek.
Sinaticus, before you start, I just want to say, to me, that's also the, you know, another reason why the failure of globalization and the difference of length. You could be arguing with someone who doesn't even, you know, they're not even from your state, and they're arguing about your state's laws.
Right. I mean, we all know who exactly you're referring to.
They could be from a different country, and they could be arguing about your country's laws. Like, someone who has no perspective on what's going on at all can argue as if they're a native.
Well, is that a fundamentally good or bad thing? Do you
bad, very, 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 very bad.
So, like, foreign nationals should be kept with a level of ignorance as to what our government's actually planning for us.
Foreign nationals? I think foreign nationals have their own channels. They can talk to people who are home and get information from, you know, family, friends. But someone who is from out of state should be kept out of state arguments, essentially.
Well, I mean, there's a difference between a different nation and a different state. I mean, obviously, you should keep people who are not a resident of your fucking country out of your country's politics, but a state is part of an overarching government.
State is a general... Sorry, you're American posting here. I use state as both a word for a country and for state.
Well, for the American states specifically, they're subdivisions under a larger federalized system. So to say, like, there's a difference between someone from another state sort of talking about another state's politics versus another nation talking about another nation's politics. Because there's no overarching system that they share.
I disagree. I think you could have used the federal argument maybe a couple years ago, a couple decades ago, that is, but not anymore.
What does that?
The differences between states have become monumental.
Are you fucking kidding me?
Really
going to tell me that?
the difference between California and fucking Nebraska. You cannot tell me that's
Are
similar.
you really gonna tell me that Florida is basically a different country from fucking Ohio? Like,
well,
so fallacious.
maybe not a different country per se, but I mean, the regions of America are known for having different cultures. Yeah.
I mean, sure, regions, but that's never been centralized to any single state. I could probably drop you in Google Maps to any point in the United States. You couldn't tell me with any degree of certainty what state you're.
Well, I mean, the local inhabitants might have a different figure of speech. This might seem like like deep, obscure, but the way people refer to soda, in particular, can give away where you are. I know most people in the Northeast will just call it Coke. People in somewhere, I don't know particularly where, but one of the regions will call it pop or soda pop. So there are like distinct.
Well, and the other thing that you're not allowed to mention is that there's another reason for there being slight cultural differences across the United States.
Well, go on, say it.
One that you're really not supposed to talk about.
No, I want my podcast to be where people feel comfortable sharing information that they might feel is a little too risky. So go ahead, say it.
Yeah,
Look,
go
I'll
ahead,
just.
Boson.
Well, no, look, I'll get back on topic with this because again, the whole fantasy of a compromise of like rhetorical debate and all this just it's not, it doesn't exist in the real world, and it really never has. It kind of existed in America for a little bit during the period where it basically was the only real economy in the entire world, but that's gone.
But I mean, we had politics in the past, like the ancient Greeks. While they disagree with each other, they would sit down and talk out their differences in a public forum. I mean, I think really what it came down to is that back in ancient Greece, you sat around, you talked about philosophy all day, you were considered a wise guy, and people would come to you for information. You do that here in, like, the United States or in any modern country, people will think you're some homeless loser without a life.
True.
And I'm not saying that's true or false, but, like, people whose jobs it is to just sit down and think don't really get paid to sit down and think anymore.
I mean, the ancient Greeks also understood that there were certain things that could not be argued. And, you could probably compromise on some issues, but in politics there are usually some things that are fundamental that you can't really budge on. I mean, for fuck's sake, the Athenian government didn't try to debate Socrates out of his fucking beliefs. They just killed him.
So Zaist.
He was voted to death. This is true.
And,
That's what I'm saying. Under the threat of violence. Violence is rhetoric.
well, then I guess we can just end the podcast here because rhetoric's not dead.
Well, no. In the Western world, it absolutely is. But in the
No,
Arab
I'm sorry,
world,
Blair. No, I'm sorry, Blairin, but the BLM riots were rhetoric.
They were.
And they're still going on. So where's the death of rhetoric?
What? BLM riots are not still going on.
Well, do riots have a significant polling power anymore? In other words, back when people rioted, like, let's wind the clock back to the Tulsa riots. All right, not to get too political on race relations here in the United States. That's a topic for another episode. But like shortly after those riots, laws were put into place as an answer to them. Have we seen anything like that occur with the BLM riots? Because
anything like what?
Absolutely, they absolutely defunded the police in a lot of states. Most of them got refunded, but it still shows that riots do have polling power.
Well, see, there you go, and they still happen. I mean, I don't know. If we're going to redefine literally all political action as rhetoric, then there hasn't been a death of rhetoric. only a certain kind of rhetoric that's considered more noble by certain people.
I'm afraid I have to agree with Boson on this one.
Mm.
I mean,
I wasn't coming in here and saying rhetoric is dead because people aren't dying out in the streets. There was a point in time where you could convince somebody without holding a sword over their neck.
But I just don't find that to be true. I mean, I don't think that's reflective of reality. It's certainly a nice fantasy. It's well, if you have enough time and you have good enough arguments, you can convince anybody to come to your side. But really, it's not true.
But what about? I mean, are you sure about that though, Boson? I mean, back when the British back during Pax Britannia, you'd think that people didn't disagree and have debate.
Well, of course they did. But what I'm saying is that I think people's beliefs and political affiliations are more fundamental to themselves than people like to give credit for. So this idea that you can just argue somebody out of any belief that they have is just not real. It doesn't happen. Maybe on certain things, but the idea that rhetoric is this all-consuming, any idea that you have can be argued. Really, that's not true.
Well, because it seems to me as though if the reality of it is that this was never the case, then wouldn't that sort of retroactively suggest that all of human history was more deterministic? That no one was ever really in control of what would occur?
Well, I wouldn't say that. I wouldn't say that certain individuals not having total control over the outcome of something makes it deterministic. Just that the outcome of certain situations are determined by more things than just human choice. There's nothing that completely determines anything. Just that, in chaos theory, certain outcomes are impossible to predict and account for. And, you bring up the quote-unquote Pax Britannia. If they could really just, have political arguments and rhetoric people out of, why didn't England just do that with all of the people rebelling in their colony?
Well, I mean...
Why did they have to use deadly force to suppress the rebellions in their colonies if they could have just argued them? Well, you see, have a debate about that.
Well, I'm not entirely sure that's what the topic...
It's only called the Pax Britannia because there were no wars in Europe. There were wars in their colony.
I mean, I'm not entirely sure that that's what the topic is really in reference to. I don't even know if I agree that violence is part of rhetoric. But I'm not sure if I agree that the notion that two sides that disagreed could never talk it out, which I'm not saying is what you're saying, but it seems as though that's what's being said, is entirely true either.
Well, no, yeah, you're taking my argument at a different scale. I'm not saying it's impossible and has never happened that someone's been convinced of something by an argument. What I'm saying is that the idea of rhetoric as an idealistic phenomenon takes as its central assumption that literally every belief that someone has can be valuable through rhetoric and arguments, which I think is just a fantasy. There are obviously some things that you'll never be able to convince somebody of. There are several political beliefs that people have that are just too fundamental to them to ever really budge on, no matter how quote-unquote good your argument is.
Okay, so then my question to you is, why is that the case? Why is it... Say this transgender swimmer, I don't know her name, Janet... I don't know her name. Or their name. I whatever. Explain to me the factors that go into the... I wouldn't call them anti-trans. I call them... you see, because these people aren't fundamentally... I mean, some of them probably are, but, they're not, they don't hate trans people. They just don't like the fact that they're able to compete in sports for biological reasons. versus the hard trans activists that say that, oh well, they have to be allowed to partake because they're women. Like, what? Why do you think that the unsurmountable gulf exists between them?
Well, because there's a bit of a difference in importance between those two sides, in the sense of, and this is why you don't want to call them anti-trans, but it's easier to call them that. This is why the anti-trans side usually loses in these encounters, and it's because to these people, all they're really arguing about is like ethics in sports. Which, I mean, even if you're like an athlete, that's not really something that anybody is like super absolute. Like, it is fundamental to me that there be good ethics in sports. But to the other side, they're literally arguing for their own like fundamental existence of their identity. Like, it's super utterly important to them that this happens, like to a mortal existential degree. And so, I mean, when you have this argument, why do you think one side always wins? Because it's way more important to that side than the other one.
So you think that? So to scale that back down, would you say that the people who are openly opposed to the spread of transgenderism as we know it today, be it right or wrong, we're not commenting here as to whether or not that's the case, you'd say that the people who are in opposition to it don't care for it as much as the other side? Like, they don't actually care at the end of the day.
There might be some that do. If like as like the larger issue in and of itself, I was mainly making a comment about the sports argument.
Right.
Talking about like the larger trans issues, I mean that's what comes into play there is you have like media bias and like the like societal cathedral and like the prominence of left wing philosophy and stuff like that. It's a bit of a larger argument to make.
Right.
There's a lot more that goes into that.
But you'd also then maintain that there was never a point in time where these two opposite forces could have ever met in the middle.
Well, what is the middle ground between you can decide to be whatever gender you want and no, you can't?
Well,
I mean, what's the compromise?
In the case of the sports, it's you were born genetically a man, and therefore you have wider shoulders and denser muscles, and you have to compete in the open competitions, which usually only men compete in. But it's open to all genders, so you have to compete in there.
Well, you don't understand, Blair. When they're talking about gender, that biology isn't a factor to them because they see them as two different things.
What? Who's this them you're referring to?
Usually, I forget there's a specific term, but it's gender abolitionists, I think. It's the correct.
Yeah.
But I mean, Sinaticus, I mean, that's really what I'm saying. I mean, on a larger philosophical case, what is the middle ground there? There really isn't one. What's the middle ground between God exists and God doesn't exist, right? I mean, there's no, it's not a spectrum.
Well,
there's no.
I mean, there may not be a middle ground on those positions, but I don't think that should come at the sort of cost of being able to coexist with your others. Like, one of the big things we disagree on, although I've defended you on it, is your statements that atheists can't be moral. That's not something I agree with. So clearly, in terms of a middle ground, I'm not trying to throw you under the bus, but would you not say I'm a little closer to it than you are in some aspects?
A middle ground on the specific issue of, is there a way for atheists to have some kind of objective justification for their moral beliefs? I guess. that one's a bit less tenuous an issue, I guess.
Well, this is the first episode. I don't want to get into anything too crazy.
But I mean, I don't know that I've really ever said that. On an individual basis, an atheist can't be a good person. I don't think I've ever said that.
No, but I didn't.
I've only ever stated that on a larger societal or philosophical level, an atheist can't really say that they're a moral person because they don't have any justification for that. And you yourself have argued very heavily against optimistic nihilism, which is basically the ideology for I'm atheist, but I'm still moral.
Yeah, you caught me there.
But again, this isn't really the argument that we're having. Talking about compromise, and there are some issues where there is a compromise, obviously, but I mean, the only point that I'm making is that there are some issues where there isn't a compromise. One does not exist. And because those issues exist, the idea that there can be some kind of all-consuming ideal implementation of some kind of like Rawlsian rhetoric marketplace of ideas utopia is just a fantasy.
Well, to ask both parties, do you think the marketplace of ideas actually exists?
No, I actually don't think that.
Really?
I mean, I think that there's like maybe a pool of ideas that are drawn from by human psychology, maybe a collective unconscious of some kind, but I wouldn't call it a marketplace. No.
I think it could be better described as the forge of ideas, forged in blood, money, or in very rare
if you do have to describe it in the case of some system, I suppose it is more of an ecosystem really than a marketplace. If you want to go the whole like selfish gene route, then it's more of an ecosystem of ideas. But really, though, I wouldn't call it a marketplace.
Yeah. And the death of rhetoric also goes in a way towards social cohesion as well. Homogenous societies have been dying out. Like everyone knows this at this point. The rare homogenous societies that do exist are ones that staunchly oppose new ideas, like Japan, China, and in some cases Russia. Russia is a little more open than those two, which is surprising for anyone who probably is watching this in current year and thinks Russia bad. But
I mean, he did.
Homogeneous societies don't have that problem that Boson mentioned, where, oh my god, my entire existence is based around this one thing. If thing don't happen, I dead.
Well, I mean, yeah, that's what they say. I mean, isn't it that you're literally killing trans people right now? Like, that's what they say.
You're literally decapitating trans people and throwing their bodies. What? And throwing their bodies off of cliffs like fucking Sparta or something.
Hey, no, you know what? If you want to be a woman, you get the Bianca Devins treatment too. Okay. So,
Excuse
they all
me.
have to
Excuse me.
But, I want to be treated just like a real woman. Okay. Well, okay. Okay. So let's. I mean, I think I've made my case as far as I'm concerned. But if there's any more clarification that's needed, maybe if Sinaticus wants to give us his own perspective to round it out.
Yeah, go ahead, Sinaticus.
I mean, I think the death of rhetoric has to do with mass individualization. We live in a world where the individual is the single most important thing that could ever possibly be. Yet, reality as it presents itself most certainly makes the hard case that you alone are not important. You as an individual might be important to yourself, but if you, live alone as an incel in your mother's basement,
what?
Then
What?
then the collective outside is not going to really care about you. And so what you have is, I think you have all of these isolated parties who view themselves as important on an individualistic level, but then don't really have high community coherence, either because they themselves can't agree on anything, like the incel movement, or they lack the sort of essence needed to attract more people to what they're actually saying. Because statistically, people in the social justice movement are not the majority. Not by a long shot. And I've said this for a lot. I've said this many times. I don't think that their movement's actually going to grow within the next 20 years. Now, we can disagree on that, but my point is that because of the way society has sort of philosophically moved itself, if the individual is the most important person, then whatever the individual thinks, by definition, must be the most important thing. Hence, you have this sort of lockjaw for the mind, where people convince themselves they know everything, when they don't. And so, I guess everyone's sort of walking around with this quasi Dunning-Kruger effect, where everyone's confident in what they're saying, but very few people are actually educated on that thing. And this is why I put such a hard importance on doing the research, because, you know, you have to actually know how to conduct research in order for your ideas to make any level of coherent sense.
Disagree.
What's the compromise on this one, Sinaticus?
I mean, there may not be a compromise. I don't know if compromising is in on itself what rhetoric ought to be, but I mean,
it could be subterfuge.
But like, we're still living in a position where our ideas are freely shared, but no one's actually listening to them. That seems like a fundamentally contradictory state of affairs, where people want to have freedom of speech, but only if it's in support of what they actually want to say. So, like, on the left, that's...
Well, I mean, that's always been the case. Even like the original like Enlightenment philosophers, just like, yes, free speech. They really, I mean, there's always been limits to it.
Well, yeah, I mean, but you can't. I mean, you can't go like total, like, you know, free speech. You can't yell fire in a crowded theater.
Well, even that, but just like, you know, like they can say that they want free speech, but there's a certain. It's just like, well, if you disagree with me on a certain thing, then you probably shouldn't be allowed to say that. Which is what free speech restrictions are for. The laws do, is they say, well, if you disagree about being able to yell fire in a crowded theater, then you don't get to do it, though. Sorry. If you disagree about what the age of consent should be, your products are not legally allowed to be sold to the public.
Give me that script!
And I mean, you know, you can say that, like, well, you know, those are just you know, those are basic moral restrictions, and it's like, well, yeah, but I mean, if the idea is that free speech should be absolute, then it should be absolute, shouldn't it?
Well, I think this is where we get back to the Rawlsian sort of marketplace of ideas. A good example of this, I think, is the Ballad of Amos Yee. You guys remember who that is?
I remember Amos Yee.
Yeah, I remember Amos Yee.
Well, so for the audience, though, you're gonna have to explain this if people have never heard of Amos Yee. Amos Yee was a Singaporean free speech advocate who essentially kept getting sent to jail for exercising free speech.
Taping dudes.
What happened is that people managed to pay for him to get here to the United States where he could be safe, only for him to essentially turn around and start advocating that pedophilia ought to be okay, even for, like, babies. And those same people who were defending Amos Yee not a year prior were all suddenly against him, and I think he's actually been jailed at this point, awaiting extradition to Singapore, which will really suck for him. But is that not a physical embodiment of the marketplace of ideas in action? I mean, because no one actually silenced Amos Yee, but at the same time, it would seem as though his attempt to sort of change the zeitgeist didn't work because his ideas just sucked.
And this idea that, like, well, if your ideas suck, no one will listen to you. Does anybody really believe that? I mean, for that to be true, every human being would have to be this perfectly rational, like, well, of course, what a horrible idea. I would never.
I mean, I don't believe that. Obviously, if that were true, we wouldn't be dealing with anti-Semitism 70 years away from the Holocaust. But I mean, we don't live in a perfect world.
100 years almost, actually. So.
1,000 years even.
Yeah, you're actually right. It's almost been a hunt. Well, we're 20 years away, so 80, 70. I wasn't too off. But those people just wouldn't exist if that were true. But in the same vein of logic, even those people, they get ostracized. Patrick Little ran his entire Californian campaign off like expelling the Jews from California. It just straight up didn't work. I mean, so like
that's a shame.
Well, okay, but again, that's not because people were so rational that they just objectively saw how bad his ideas were. If he ran in fucking Nazi Germany, he would have probably won something. It's more about what's acceptable rather than what's rationally good or evil. As far as what becomes popular, at least. I mean, you could say that there's objectively bad ideas that are really popular, and in fact, legislation in the U.S. right now. How could that be possible if, like, it's just
or ideas
like you can cherry pick about certain times in which bad ideas failed, but there are an infinitely equal amount of times that bad ideas have succeeded and continue to succeed.
That's actually a really good point. What were you about to say, Blairin?
No, I just think you don't have to win the marketplace of ideas. That's why I don't think the marketplace of ideas is a real thing. The best ideas will never emerge. The ideas from the person who holds the reins of power will emerge. Napoleon probably didn't have the best ideas. Napoleon had the army of France.
So then that I guess that moves the conversation to an entirely new one. Like, are those who are in power the ones that get to decide what rhetoric is? And if so, is it not moral for the liberal establishment as it exists now to continue asserting its will?
In what sense?
In the sense that they are in power and they want to see more liberals, therefore they will continue to spread liberal propaganda no matter how true or false it might be.
Well, no. Because they're evil. Because they're evil, so...
There we go.
It's so fucking true. So fucking true.
Well, and you'll get these people. I'm sure that there's for certain people the instant response will be like, "Well, from my perspective, you're evil," and it's like, so. Is that supposed to make me not think you're evil?
But you didn't answer my first bit. Are the people in power the ones that always have control over rhetoric? Because that seems to be where we've led ourselves.
I mean, can you give me an example of a situation where that's not the case? Whether or not it's, like, moral, I mean, for that to be true.
Right, well, we're not
objectively speaking, usually it is the case. And I think you'd be hard-pressed to find an example where that didn't happen.
I mean, I'm not... not too
Not necessarily saying that it's a good thing that that's the case, right?
Right.
It's always just who's in power that controls what's moral. That's not necessarily a good thing, but I mean, usually, I mean, yeah, that's true. I mean, that's in nearly every case that is what happens.
Mm-hmm.
So, I guess.
And there's really no way to combat it because the only way to sort of stop that would be to sort of for an entity that's in power to erode its own control, which would just mean that a different person would come to power anyway. So it's like you can't really stop it from happening. It's paradoxical.
Well, I guess with that we'll move to concluding thoughts. Believe it or not, it's been an hour.
Well, I do want to make one compunction because you were right about to bring up one thing, and that was just like well, is it good for like whoever's in control to be in charge of what's moral? And we talked about this a lot. And despite my crowing about like what's reality and what's fantasy, I mean, you know me, I don't believe that that morality is subjective. Obviously, there is an objective good and evil.
Right. So from your current point of view, evil is just prospering all around the world at the moment.
Yeah, and I don't really see any fundamental contradiction between that and the idea that whoever's in control controls what's moral. It just means that the people who are good are going to have to fight to gain control over any society that they're in, and I know that might be considered like a radicalist, like call to action, because it's like I'm literally saying that you can't debate your way out of it. But I mean, whether or not people, I don't know. It just
well now I have to know what's. I mean, like, because we're now going to like. This is kind of what the BLM rioters all think, right?
Well,
yeah.
they're right.
And so they're out there fighting for it, though. But we don't see them as being in the right, though.
Well, because of course they're the ones with the establishment of control. The media backs them, and they're allowed to establish what is okay in this society to fight for under rhetoric, and what is not okay. And what is not okay is Charlottesville, and what is okay is burning down the Twin Cities.
I see. Okay, so because they're not really in the minority, and they actually really do have the institutional power, I guess you could say that they're sort of like a roving band of like rogue knights, yeah, going around burning the local peasantry just because they can get away with it.
What the hell is this guy talking about, Boson?
Knights? Glory hammer? But I mean, I don't know. I don't agree with Blairin really on that. And that, like, well, they're immoral because they're the majority. I feel like that sets a dangerous precedent.
I didn't say they were immoral. I said they're allowed to do it because they have, they have the rule that we established that defines rhetoric.
I don't know if you said that, but it seems like that's what Sinaticus extrapolated. I want to say that I don't agree with that.
Yeah, I don't really think there is a morality here or there to talk about. I mean, in my eyes, I want to amend my statement about the marketplace of ideas earlier. In my eyes, the marketplace of ideas is only open when the previous marketplace collapses. It's only open for about as much time as it takes to reestablish, and that's with air quotes, society. So, examples of this are Alfred the Great reforming after pushing back the Danes, the collapse of the Western Roman Empire, the American Revolution. Those were the times when the marketplace of ideas was really open, and you could actually do some crazy stuff. You can't really call it the marketplace of ideas nowadays. Nowadays, it's the pawn shop of ideas. You get to use some idea that some guy already came up with 20 years ago that you might be able to push in if you buy it half off, and you don't really get to use all the functions because it's kind of rusted.
If you're going to define like the marketplace based on whether or not there are new ideas, I mean,
no,
never anything new under the sun.
That's not what I'm talking about. What I'm talking about is the implementation of ideas, and you're never going to be able to implement an idea fully in this current time period. It has to be one of strife.
But I mean, it's a precarious situation because I think on a fundamental level, people want the marketplace ideas thing to be true. They want there to be a society where ideas can sort of be freely exchanged, and they want it to be true that you can convince someone to be on the right path, whatever. The problem is that when you then say, let's try to do something to cause that to always be the case by force, you usually end up badly because in most situations, people can't really be convinced. On a lot of issues, there is no compromise, and so what you'll just create is this like unending bureaucratic state where everyone's just trying to convince other people who will never be convinced of something. Nothing gets done. On some level, I think if you're going to create a society, you have to admit that there has to be a vision, that at some point two parties will come into conflict and there can't be a compromise and there will need to be a decision made.
And
Rhetoric can't decide everything.
And that will subsequently always lead to bigger conflict.
So you just want to kill trans people then? That's what you're saying?
Well, expound on that, Sinaticus. What do you mean that'll lead to bigger conflict?
I mean, if two sides can never really agree on anything, and it'll always...
Is that what I said, though?
No, but that is what eventually will happen, though.
Well, the two sides can't agree on anything now, really.
So it's relevant to the time. Okay.
Well, no. Listen to what I'm fucking saying.
I'm just extrapolating. I'm sorry.
There are certain issues in which there can be no compromise made because it's a completely binary issue. You're not going to be able to argue someone into agreeing or getting to compromise with that issue because it's impossible. The problem is that if you have a society where like the governing legislation is predicated on compromise, when it comes time to figure out these issues, you'll just have gridlock because no one's going to be able to be convinced on these things. And so, but if you want to avoid that happening, what you'll have to admit to yourself is these issues are going to arise in which there can be no compromise. In the planning of our society, a decision is going to have to be made here. Based on what we as a society want as a whole, what decision will we make?
All right.
And the people who disagree are going to have to live with it. Because there can't be a compromise. It's impossible. And as sad as that is, again, I don't think there's anybody that really wants that to happen on a fundamental level. That's what needs to happen for the society to actually function and be healthy. And it's not like this is unprecedented. I mean, in a lot of older societies, maybe in Europe, issues of religion were like this. There were certain political things that were decided on and you could argue about. There was rhetoric, but in a lot of issues, the church had final say. Whatever the church decided, that was what we did, and there could be no argument about that. And you could say that maybe that led to some bad things happening, and maybe that's true. But ultimately, I think that's a preferable state to nothing occurring and being trapped in a perpetual state of just total, absolute ideological gridlock because people are trying to convince other people of issues that can't be compromised or convinced about. Do you understand what I'm trying to say?
Yeah, I understand where you're coming from. I'm not sure if anything more can be said on this topic. If not, I'm just going to close things out.
Does Blairin have anything else he wants to say about what I've been saying?
We need. I'll say what I've been saying. We need slaughter. We need strife. The only way we can have real change in a society where rhetoric can actually live and convincing someone can have more effect than them saying, what are you, an alt-right incel? Online is through a time of strife where you either come together and listen or you die separate.
Well, that's something that I thought would come up more, but hasn't really. Do you think that the internet has any part to play in what you perceive to be the death of rhetoric?
Yep. Yeah.
In what way?
I mean, I think the geographic differences, like the state argument we did earlier, where people from different states will like pretend they know what's going on in your state and will advocate as if they know you, as if they know anything about your culture or your communities.
Is that something that's exclusive to the age of the internet, though?
It is.
You don't think people...
I think it definitely is. Yeah.
I mean, you don't think people living in Sicily had an opinion on maybe what the Roman Empire was doing in Gaul at any point? Like,
well, that's different. I think that's slightly different.
Why is that different?
Because unlike most states, Sicily is provided. It basically stopped the entire Roman civilization from starving to death. There was more of an active role it played in politics.
Okay, well then, fucking, I don't know, Iberia then, whatever. Like,
Iberia did not care.
There was nobody in Iberia that cared what the Roman Empire did in Gaul. I mean, I have trouble believing that that's true.
Maybe the Roman government, and maybe the Roman governor, but yes, big things maybe. And this is going to seem pedantic, and maybe it is. Big things maybe, but when you get someone like trouncing on your sovereignty because they're like, actually, grooming isn't a problem in your state. It's like, are you from my state?
I mean, the issue though,
I have a pretty good handle on Floridian politics.
The issue though, Blairin, is that a lot of those people that are opposing the specific bill that you're talking about are in Florida. There's a huge contingent of people in Florida that are like virulently opposed to the bill. That's probably where most of the opposition is coming from.
But the vast majority of the people talking online and trying to debate it,
I don't know that that's true.
Yeah, no,
that'd be a hard thing to prove.
Yeah, okay. Let me try to prove it then.
Well, and also the entire opposition to the bill originates in Florida. I mean, otherwise people wouldn't even probably know about it.
Well, it's because outside actors have been trying to turn Florida blue since fucking the year 2000. Well, since forever.
Well, again, I don't know that that's exclusive to the internet. People have been trying to flip states since the Electoral College was invented.
In-state actors were trying to flip their states. I think it's different than a globalized corporation known as the Democratic Party specifically trying to flip states.
I mean, I'm just trying to pare down like what about that situation is exclusive to the age of the internet, because party politics has been a thing since like the 20s. And like I said, people have been trying to flip states since forever. What exactly is the role of the internet to play in this, like, in the opposition to this bill in Florida? I mean, I understand that the internet probably has a role to play in what you perceive as the death of rhetoric in general, but this example of, like, people in other states caring what happens in other states is just, I don't know that that's really a symptom of the internet as much as just of federalized system. It just seems to me, I guess the main thing that we should probably want to get back to is like the efficacy of trying to like argue with people on the other side. Yes. And
and I think that has trying to do that. You have to have legitimacy, and it's a lot easier for legitimacy when you're arguing with a Roman about Roman politics when you live in Rome. It's harder to argue with a Floridian about Floridian politics when you live in California.
well, I mean, for what issues? I mean, you can say Floridian politics, but this bill that you're talking about, there's not really anything specific to Florida about it. It's just a law about like gay education in schools, which is applicable to the entire country.
The propagandist Boson comes out to play yet again. All right, let's do this.
I'm just saying, like, should I, like, if that bill fails, should I be allowed to say, oh, it sucks that bill didn't go through, even though I don't live in Florida?
I mean, I know.
Just seems like
you are allowed to give me kind words of support. Yes.
I mean, I know that my conservative friends really want it to be enacted up here.
Yeah, well, I mean,
well, sorry, but they're not allowed to have an opinion.
That's just not. Yeah, well, it's kind of none of their business. It's Rome for the Romans.
What do you mean it's none of their business? What about that bill is specific to Florida?
It's being enacted solely for Floridians and their children.
Okay.
What?
Okay. What about specifically Florida's like location, culture, history, or economy is dealt with that bill? It's a cultural issues bill. It's a social issues bill that's applicable to the entire country in any state. The exact same bill could be proposed in any state without any change.
But it's going on Floridian citizens. That's the whole point.
Okay, listen.
So I want Floridian citizens to debate whether a bill is going to go on Floridian citizens.
I know they're legalizing murder in fucking North fucking Dakota, but you're not allowed to argue about whether or not murder's wrong. Rome for the Romans. You're a retard.
I actually think if they legalize murder, that'd be kind of zarst.
This is the thing. The important issue here is Blairin keeps trying to turn this into a states' rights argument. I don't understand why. This is not what we're talking about. The whole point is the efficacy of trying to convince someone who disagrees with you. The thing about that is, I think that there are a lot of people who just say, like, well, rhetoric is dead, don't even try to convince other people. And while I think on a larger scale that's probably true, on an individual basis, I would say that I think that there's still some worth in trying, if that makes any sense.
Okay, yeah, but why should you try? Why should you try, Boson?
Well, because if you have a certain political leaning, your livelihood will be affected by, and not when I say livelihood, I don't just mean like, oh, my personal GDP. I mean like the quality of life that you're living will be affected.
You mean science?
Well, I think I might have a good reason for why one should try.
Okay.
Correct me if I'm wrong on this, Blairin. Or rather, I'll posit it as a question. Has your view on religion changed due to talking at length with myself or Boson, or both?
Nope.
Well, alright then. I guess I'll list someone who has. I know Almighty. I know.
I'm sorry to shit on you. I still think religion's bunk.
I mean,
you've got so many amazing atheist societies to choose from that can give you a good example of that. I mean, it's just I understand where you're coming from.
You are so bad. Every time I bring up oh my god, you remember the amazing atheist? You're exactly like him, you know? No, I don't shove bananas up my ass.
You will.
You will. You will.
You will. Florida's going to pass the Say Gay bill. They're going to force you to put bananas up there, and you're going to cry for help, and you know what we'll say? Rome for the Romans, bitch.
A very, very, very odd specific bill, and I think that has something and I think that's just more fucking
But
I think that's just more
go back.
more transparent of your gay fetish, which is really annoying.
Yeah, you're projecting, but Blairin, go back, or Sinaticus, go back to Almarduk, the Almarduk example that you were talking about.
Our collective associate, Almarduk, who is a moderator on the RPC Discord. They started off as a hard anti-theist. They started off as someone who straight up hated religion, and I can confirm that prolonged conversation with me has turned them into just a regular, respectful atheist.
Oh, wait. Am I an anti-theist?
Are you?
Why are you asking us?
Why are you asking us? I would figure you'd know that.
Am I retarded? I don't know.
I didn't know that. I fuck off. I didn't know that existed. I thought you could only be an atheist. There's a philosophy where you hate religion?
Yes, it's called anti-theism.
I have to decide on that.
Well,
I'll get back to you.
I said that you're likely an apatheist. You don't really care for the topic in general. Anti-theists are the type of... We need to get rid of God altogether. The very idea of God is what's wrong with this world. And as soon as we get rid of God, all peace will be known.
And I mean, you know what? Mao Zedong was right about that. China's more peaceful than ever. Glory. Glory to the fucking heavenly man. But yeah, I mean, I suppose it's an interesting thing to think about is that you can't, like, even if you don't necessarily convince someone to change their beliefs, you could perhaps soften their perspective on your own. I don't know.
Well, I mean,
but it seems like a lot of work for a little payoff.
Well, I don't think that's a little. I think the switch from anti-theist to atheist is huge. That's one less person who is actively assaulting the notion of religion in general, and is essentially a intellectually non-threatening presence.
I suppose it's just where you want to focus your energy, because you could go around trying to soften atheists' perspective on religion one at a time, but maybe that's something you wouldn't even have to do if perhaps you focused your energy more to a political goal of restoring a basic, like, religious framework to a nation at large. To that point, the atheist perspectives won't even matter anymore.
Yeah, but I think that they should be allowed to speak their position. Well, it's more along the lines of, in my opinion, strong atheists create strong theists. In other words, religious people won't be educated until atheism becomes such a large enough threat that the young earther evangelical base simply won't be able to cope with it, and like rational theism will take its place.
I don't think that that's necessarily that holds true. The issue of religious people being educated in this country, at least, is an issue of people being educated in this country in general. The reason we have retarded Christians is because they're retarded American. I mean, think about like medieval philosophy was like all of this, like, intellectual Christian theology. Did that have to be formulated because the atheists were just so smart back then? I mean, I don't know that that's.
Well, I mean, they were virtually non-existent back then.
Yeah, well, yeah, and they still did it. So I don't know that it's necessarily an if-then, but I mean, I would agree with you that there's an issue of education in this country, but that's not really the argument that we're having. Just
as we approved Rhetoric is dead, I still hold the same beliefs as when we started. I think the decentralization and globalization of the world has left us less understanding of others' positions. I think the lack of any strife or crises has basically made it an impossibility to get any real change done in the world. And your idea is based not on how well you say it or how well the idea would work in actuality. The idea is based upon how much money or power you have behind it. Rhetoric is more become a transposition of power, but one could argue that's how it's always been. Rare places like Greece and, for a time, the Roman Republic are oddities in the overall scheme of open politics and not the rule.
All right, Boson, final thoughts.
I agree. The Roman Republic was kind of an oddity. The way that they debated Julius Caesar to death was honestly brilliant. Yeah.
It was an empire at that point, sweetheart. He was king.
No.
He was king of Italy.
Anyway,
He was king. They offered him a crown.
I'm king of Italy. Well, suppose that my main point is that it's important to understand that certain things are irreconcilable. Mm-hmm. There are perhaps many issues in which there can be a compromise reached, where perhaps rhetoric might be useful, but human beings usually have within them fundamental... I'm not sure exactly what word it is that I'm looking for, but like they're like the axioms on which their entire perspective of the world is built.
Ethics? Fulcrums?
Maybe, I don't know. Fulcrum. Fucking levers, pulleys, but those things in most cases can really not be shaken. And I suppose it's a difference of maybe where that person is in their lives and stuff like that. But in a lot of cases, on these fundamental perspectives, there can't really be any compromise. And I mean, those are the things that people fight over. I mean, the fact that war happens at all is proof enough that the idea of a purely like open society, as far as like a marketplace of ideas, isn't all-consuming, always helpful or useful. Because war happens. And it can be hard to know the difference in certain cases. I think what the best thing for you to do is, examine yourself, examine what your own beliefs are, and if you're in a situation in which you think that it might help to try and convince somebody, then you certainly can try. No guarantee that you'll be successful, but I think it might be worth the effort. But I think what most people's energy is best spent on is trying to initiate change on a more wide-scale level, rather than trying to engage in rhetoric.